سلام میکنم به همه
Hello, dear pals and friends, excellencies, participants in this session. I'm very delighted and glad to be here with you in this gathering with the topic we are going to speak. We are going to speak about the conservation of historic fabric and also the paradoxes in conservation of such fabrics in our country. First and foremost, I'd like to express my words of welcome to Mr. Farhangi and Dr. Moshtagh-Gohari. I'm going to briefly introduce the excellencies. Mr. Adel Farhangi is a graduate of architecture from the Fine Arts School of the University of Tehran. He's got a long-standing experiences in restoration and conservation of historic buildings. He is also representative of international ICOMOS in some World Heritage List monuments. He is also a member of the Ministry of Cultural Heritage. He is a member of the, drafting department for a kind of conservation fund in Iran. He's also the faculty member of the faculty in a group developing regulations for conservation of Persian gardens, and so on and so forth. I suffice to say that only. Dr. Kambiz Moshtagh-Gohari is a faculty member of Sistan Baluchestan University. He used to be also Director General of the Cultural Heritage Department in Sistan Baluchestan province in southeastern Iran. For some time also, he was also Director in Ministry of Roads and Urban Development. So the scholars who have accepted our invitations are the ones with a long experience on this topic. I'm very glad and they are here and I appreciate them for their presence. We're going to speak about the paradoxes and also the legal and approach paradoxes in Iran in particular. So in the historic fabrics and historic buildings in Iran, there are some regulations and attitudes or approaches. I've heard that they focus mostly on maximum conservation. At the same time, we see massive demolitions in historic fabrics. Now, we'd like to look into this problem. Where are the challenges in laws and legislations or the experts' approaches? Or somewhere else. This is what we are going to look into and discuss. We got two parts in our session. In the first part, we speak about the legislations, laws, and approaches. And in the second part, we are going to present a case. That's a case study, and that's the Gholam Rasoul tomb. And in the second part, we're going to discuss that and present it. So let me start the meat of our presentation today and talk about what we want to discuss in the first part. I start to pose a question to Dr. Gohari. Well, based on your experience and background and cultural heritage, do you think that all laws and experts' approaches are convergent? What is your reading of them, and if they are aligned or convergent or divergent, and what is the impact of each of these sectors? I mean, the legislations and approaches, particularly in terms of historic fabric conservation, conservation of Iranian cultural heritage, particularly historic fabric. I mean, so please, thank you. Greetings to all dear participants. I'm very delighted. I was given this opportunity to speak about one of the gravest concerns of modern cultural heritage in Iran, and about conservation of the historic fabric. We are going to have a critical viewpoints. In our country, this is not widely welcome, criticism. But in the cultural heritage area, just avoiding criticism would lead to some irreversible damages. So as an architect, as a teacher, as an activist in cultural heritage area, and one who's a fan of Iranian history, for years, I've been interacting with the society, the management, and policymakers for years. At the beginning of my career, I thought that why people do not value or minister these monuments. They are heir to a, let's say, historic monument or building, but they are very laxative in their conservation, and they easily just replace it with a modern building. In the early years of my career, when I was involved in inscription of these buildings, actually, I used to blame the society. The society is not well aware of the historic values of a building, and they just focus on speculation, business gains, and they prefer it over the cultural values. When I was a director general in cultural heritage, I had to make some tough decisions because, for example, a family asset was a historic building and it was inscribed as World Heritage on the World Heritage list, and the family could not, enhance it, upgrade it, replace it, sell it, could not also live into it, and then because of its dilapidating conditions, but in the market, they are bought at very low price, be 1/3 of a, let's say, counterpart, because of the laws we have in Iranian cultural heritage. Additionally, because of having a buffer zone, and the neighborhood also faced some restrictions, and it is really a tough decision as member of the executive, to enforce law, and you need to protect the interests of your organization. You have to enforce law precisely about an aging landlord, for example, or his family. And then one has to, incline towards conservation of the building and stop any interventions in that building. In the years, I was a member of the staff in the Cultural Heritage Organization department. I saw different movements of, World Heritage process, listing or inscription process. It was very easy earlier as an international inscription. That was a national inscription, was very easy. So one example is this Rasoul tomb. I saw that in the Cultural Heritage Organization, I thought that they are facing a gridlock. And that was the day when I tendered my resignation and switched to a different organization. That was the Ministry of roads and urban development, where they also, of course, supervised and implemented many urban development master plans. There was somebody who cared about cultural heritage very much, and the Supreme Council of Urban Development was also overseeing intervention in the historic fabrics. There, I noticed that in my capacity, there, I realized that all historic fabrics in our country, in Iran, are being widely damaged and destroyed and demolished. And have been abandoned by Iranian citizens. And usually those who are homeless have been residing there, or Afghan refugees are living there in those abandoned buildings, historic buildings. In one meeting in the Supreme Council of Urban Development, I was talking in one meeting, we were blaming general public for such demolition and such a speculation of real estate. And I said we were really wrong. Because of our laws for the cultural heritage, we have not paved the way for the owners' benefit from such historic fabric. Usually our management are inactive. I mean, we see the inaction. I also blame myself in this area as an academician. For example, in the Carpet Museum of Iran, you know, there was a fountain, they turned it into a garden, vegetable garden, I can tell you. So what can be the approach there? Or in Tehran, you know, the historic fabric is demolished. You know, many of academicians or scholars in cultural heritage don't stage any protesters. So in this area, we have a small number or a handful of people who are really seeking or pursuing this agenda to protect and conserve historic fabric. And I had a phone conversation with one of the directors in this area, and then he said that you should not pursue this path. Why do you go online and make it like an online campaign? You know, he was complaining about me. And this is a start of a kind of behind the scene fixing to demolish different buildings for different applications or land uses. I've seen that time and again, such fixings and such relations, behind the curtain relations, and usually the owner or the municipalities are blamed, and they talk about only speculation. Also, conservation people in action is never seen into this equation. No, and almost any changes, interventions, upgrading is impossible in such buildings. Sometimes I tell my friends that, okay, tell me what your tune is, and then we can dance to your tune. Remember, Iranian traditional architecture is based on change. Mashhad in Isfahan has got 1,000 years of history of 1,000 years of changes. Iranian agriculture, Iranian architecture cared about the livability of the buildings. They should have played a key role in urban life. So you see the big mosque in, you know, that we have had the latest buildings is the actually the brick coverage. I mean, you see many yellow and black punies decorations. That was an effort made by architects and during Qajar dynasty, so that, you know, they made the buildings like aligned with what they had as buildings during Qajar dynasties in terms of color and facade. in many other countries, in fabric like George Pond or Cologne Cathedral, or the relics of buildings in Berlin after Second World War, they developed, merged, and operated buildings, and the building is now part of the urban life. But our colleagues here don't follow that path. They have a kind of minimalist interpretation, and has made the life difficult for our people. They have put our people as enemies of the cultural heritage, department. They know if they have a history building, they cannot, restore it, they cannot innovate it, they cannot conserve it, they just need to conserve it, that's all. But modern life in Iran, you cannot use like the tannins or a container of water for your, let's say, for using the bathroom. It's not like old days. Even the directors in cultural heritage departments, they can never themselves live in such historic buildings, in those conditions, the circumstances. As they are not a beneficiary there, they easily pass judgments or make decisions about such fabric buildings. I know many building experts in the cultural heritage department who easily and readily, inscribe a building of a family, and I can specify the name. There was a 70-year-old man who had only one building, a historic building, and they prosecuted him legally when he wanted to make some small changes to a building, so they turned into enemies of the cultural heritage. It's not people's problem, it is our problem. It's the Ministry of Cultural Heritage fault. They have not been able to offer a solution in this area. I tell you today, determinedly, that the Ministry of Cultural Heritage is the first defendant in demolition of fabric buildings. Many of such buildings are abandoned. The excessive development of industries like in Ardekan, in central Iran, a big portion of, influx of refugees or immigrants going to these cities, and they, reside in such historic buildings, and they destroy them or damage them. And then, as an expert who thinks differently, you should have a kind of tough criticism and follow up. You should be persistent. I sent my complaints and also shared my complaints in front of all directors in the ministry. I said that, for example, our end building in Sari is set ablaze, and Sari city municipality, will pursue its urban development project based on that fire. You should have an economic plan for this. All the, the business stories in the fabric, in the historic fabric, are now tied to just tourism. Yes, tourism is shut down in Iran. Which tourist? Based on what plan are you going to bring tourists and to gain economic benefits? There are not many international, tourists here because of our foreign policy. Our foreign policy is not aligned with international tourism. And they have some problems in Iran if we don't also fund or provide budget to the historic fabric. The middle class in Iran cannot, compete with hotels to make investments in this area. So my conclusion, definitely our tomorrow is, I tell you, darker than today. Ministry of Cultural Heritage has, since it has turned into a ministry of cultural heritage, handicraft, and tourism, there was no single informed director to be appointed as a minister. The ministers are only politicians. And you see the maximum demolition caused by such ministers and politicians. as well as some director generals, and I have to be open here, and I speak openly. I've also, by the way, shared this criticism with the different ministry staff member and management. In Organization of Cultural Heritage, we had some hot topics and discussions, and I said that these directors should be blamed and should not be let into areas such as cultural heritage. The big problem arose when, at the beginning of the Cultural Heritage Organization, I think it was in 2001, 2002, they turned into, you know, the tourism, handicraft, and the Cultural Heritage Organization. There are also some, I can tell you, great people, scholars and experts, to bring that organization as a part of the presidential office. Because everything was based on politics. But you know, they changed, I tell you, the organization's gazette very easily. And this organization for many years has been seen as a backyard for politicians or politicized managers. So many key people have left that organization. Most importantly, the experts there are not courageous enough to speak their mind or speak up. I want to say that people like me who know about very well about the cultural heritage, and if we don't speak about the grave mistakes made in this area, we will turn into assistants of these demolishers. The existing minister of the cultural heritage had some, I tell you, inaccurate speech about Pasargad near Shiraz and other historical sites. And many experts didn't speak up against him. There was just a letter I saw that some experts had signed as a petition against the minister, but I think that's not sufficient. We need a kind of cohesion. Otherwise, politicians will see this area as a battlefield for themselves, and the cultural heritage experts would just suffice to inscription. And then if they don't succeed or fail, is say, well, we did our best, but we couldn't do it. But this is our treasure, civilizational treasure, and this is irreversible. As then, you know, after many invasions and conflicts, we have remained as Iranian because of these monuments and historic fabrics. That's it from me. Thank you. And I'll talk in the next part more. Thank you, Doctor. Engineer Farhangi, Mr. Farhangi, we started our discussion with the question that the legislation and expert approaches, if they are divergent, convergent, and their impact on the monuments. The last speaker, I think my impression was that the last speaker was blaming Ministry of Cultural Heritage, their inaction, the complicating legislations, and they have a narrow interpretation of intervention and development. I want to know your contribution in this area. What is your approach or attitude as towards the massive demolitions and damages we see in historic fabrics in our country, in Iran? Mr. Gohari's concerns are shared among many, I can tell you. I think in 2013, one of our colleagues, and I think Mr. Gohari knows him, whose name is Shaheen Tulu, wanted to immigrate to another country. I think to Australia. And then we found a university together in Australia, And I suggested a subject for research, and that was this. I mean, this issue. And then the topic was subject was the following subtopic for research. I said, well, cultural heritage in its universal format has been agreed, and different parts of the world pay tribute and respect to cultural heritage. Some laws and regulations are also conserved based on commonly agreed regulations and laws. People get involved in conservation, and these monuments also play a role in modern life. But how come that in some societies, well, some societies are more successful, and some like ours, we are a bit unhappy? Well, we know that even countries that are happy with conservation of the historic fabric, they're not in the same level. The world is the world of diversity. Even among the nation states, there are some differences. I give you an example. In Germany, they care a lot about cultural heritage, but in the UK, that's a different story. And in Italy, that's a different story. You mentioned some cities. You see that in London, for instance, after modern development, or what they want to have modern life in an old city like London, you see different interventions. But in the Rome center, you don't see such developments or interventions. I mentioned this point to say that even among developed countries who are advanced in conservation of cultural heritage and historic values, there are some differences. However, the fact is that when you come to other countries that have some common challenges, or maybe different challenges, but they have facing big challenges, and you see a gap among them or between them. I remember that in 2000, in the year 2000, there was the head of the World Heritage Department. I don't remember his or her name. I had a meeting with him, and then we discussed this issue. He believed that, I just quote his words, you have to shift from a single dimensional approach to a multi-dimensional approach. Well, that was his idea. But cultural heritage is refocused to cultural landscape or heritage, from just considering one single monument. Think of maybe the joint river between France and Spain, or maybe the slavery in Africa. In some countries where people are unhappy about cultural heritage conservation, our issues are beyond these areas. It seems that, we don't have, just one organization is not responsible for this area. I remind you of the law adopted in 1930. That was during the Pahlavi dynasty. This law was enacted there, and it focuses on what they call cultural values then, but now we call it cultural heritage. In that law, they underline it. In that law, interestingly, they talk about the legal procedures. If any plot or monument is damaged, government should be accountable to any damages made in that building or monument. And well, since 1979, you see that law is out of operation. I mean, it's not functional anymore. You see executives after the revolution in 1979, which introduced a new circumstances in the society. So you see that the law, if a law considers one area, it needs to get also updated later on. Another example. Well, we've seen academic process in the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran. Different universities are established, different faculties are established. And we'll see some disciplines such as, that are related to our area. You see that, well, some students study, get educated, and graduate. But you see that when they are graduated, they have to work under different legal framework. You see that there are some laws. I'll give you an example. Well, I'll give an example of Iran. The circumstances are changing, so they can, and they fail. And also the university's goals and objectives change or shift. So in 2000, we concluded, in the year 2000, we concluded that we need to include environment and culture heritage into our development plans. So in the fourth development plan, then we partly managed to cover this area in the plan, or by the plan. As a matter of fact, even there, we could not succeed. That's what it seems, and seemingly we couldn't succeed. Mr. Gohari mentioned it very well. It seems that there are some policies that are not committed to cultural heritage. They care about other areas. Usually, I see these sectoral policies, aligned with the goals in a society, or macro policies. Well, the sectoral policies cannot protect the interests of the sector, but focus on the, the general goals or macro goals. So you see that sector falls victim to the national goals. But Gohari said that in the Ministry of Cultural Heritage, there are no experts in the cultural heritage area, or even in tourism, to be introduced or appointed as the minister. It is because of those national goals. Sectoral policy makers feel committed to national goals and dependent on them, rather than being dependent or affiliated to sectoral policies. That's why when Mr. Shahin Tulu was immigrating to Australia, I suggested this subject on the following subjects. Why did universal values of cultural heritage are translated into these deficiencies in certain countries? Well, I suggested he can work on Iran as a case study, and then that university in Australia, other universities can add up to that topic. And then at the end of the day, after a study, we can arrive at some conclusions based on, the dissatisfaction with cultural heritage conservation. And then we would be able to address some of these dissatisfactions and turn them into satisfaction in those certain countries. So in the past years, many have made the same statement, and I'm representing those people. So the master key to this issue is alignment of sectoral policies and national policies or goals. It's not just for cultural heritage area. In other areas, like bigger areas like the economy, in economy, for example, we expect economists to address, forex fluctuation issues, but you see that senior politician, he sets some goals which are not aligned with the expertise or ideas of experts. Yeah, it would be maybe a quick or short-term solution, but that would victimize other areas. That was for economy. Well, some sciences like economy, sociology, and environment studies and cultural heritage studies as disciplines that can be very valuable, but they have fallen into this process and they are diminished. Well, what Mr. Gohari said just fall under this. They are not in a position to have a powerful intervention. Dr. Gohari knows very well that if they insisted on their policies or of their own preferences, they would be definitely they would be bothered. I think we should look at this big picture. Well, if any questions, I can then go into more details, but I wanted to show you this big picture so that you would see what the main problem is, or if you have anything against me or any criticism, I can address them. Thank you, Mr. Farhangi, for your presentation. Dr. Gohari, we discussed the let's say macro goals or national goals in cultural heritage. That's what the last speaker said. But the next question is that let's talk about the community of professionals and experts. Well, regardless of being positive or negative, I think you see this minimalist development approach among the experts. I've heard from many cultural heritage experts and professionals about this. I can share you with some examples. There have been some workshops with some Italian, German scholars, and they endorse or promote this approach. I've been to some workshops, and there have been some discussions among Iranian students and the European trainers. Iranians' discussions were very cautious, conservative. Well, there was a big argument with Italian scholars that why this much development has been made in, let's say, Udlajan fabric, or why do they add, let's say, kind of shed light into an historic fabric or a window into a fabric ceiling. Now, my question is that where does it come from? I'm going to talk about just professionals. Well, what I am going to say is not my idea. A German philosopher has said that we have a kind of abstinence in thinking, in thought. We should just users of some ideas. Yes, we see that some ideas just come in a, let's say, contradiction with others, and that causes some problems in some areas. And then we decide also to train experts from the basics. I think the trainer was Italian, and then we had some expert who involved in restorations, and they're focusing mostly on conservation. Of course, they had some designing workshops too, but that workshop was not so advanced to know about, you know, contemporary architecture and to be able to consider that areas. One day, I remember that I was following my issue of printing a book, or publishing a book. And then I was told I need to publish the book in a different country. In Iran, they care about blue-eyed people and blonde-haired people. You know? So I think a kind of disease. You should not forget it. I think it's something that comes from Europe, is very valuable and important. I mean, this is the approach of our experts. So as we see some, I tell you, our academia, educational institutions are about to collapse because universities need to generate some ideas, but they don't. I was at Sistan Baluchestan University. It was established in 1971. I mean, for about 50 years, it's a university. They have disciplines in different areas. From architecture, engineering, and so on and so forth. 20 minutes drive away from that university, you see some slumdog or shanty towns that are real. Maybe you can see that only in Bombay, in Mumbai. And after 50 years, they have not been able to study the shanty town in Karimabad, Shiraz, in areas around in that province. They don't care about that in research. But they know about the latest development in Western countries, for example. But you see that this is just the case in Iran. But we don't nationally look into our major problems. You know, our academic or educational system is in 70 years of transition. In France, I've got my PhD in Beaux-Arts in Paris. Where, you know, there are some important art galleries. The most important art galleries are based there. But in France, our French friends have not been solved such of these problems. And the French architecture school of thought is being trained, but this is not, doesn't address our main problems. In our architecture education, they don't talk about water. Earthquake is our national challenge, But at universities, it is not being educated or discussed at all. So there is a contradiction or paradox. You know, some criticism should be burning. If it is not burning or biting, nobody would care about it. That's why I criticize them. You know, people are, people of chastity, you care a lot about our honor and reputation and image. So we try to speak, in a way that everybody is happy, not to offend anybody, not to make anybody sad or unhappy. So our experts, our academicians have turned into people who speak indirectly. Nobody is moved and nobody is touched. So our problem is not solved. Today, we are destroying our environment. We are intentionally demolishing our historic buildings and monuments because of this disease. I mean, planning is important in all areas. And planning should be there in provision of services and products. So they face some concepts like justice and democracy. In our social political areas, without these concepts, you cannot solve all the sectional problems, like last speaker said. Let me raise one point just to build up on what Mr. Farhangi said. As long as we don't raise awareness among people, we are not courageous enough to speak up. A quotation is, courage is not because of our muscles or political, support. It comes out of awareness. So intellectualism mostly focuses on awareness and courage, being courageous enough to speak up, not just relationships and fixings. So you cannot make a change unless you raise awareness and you're insistent on that, and then you're ready to pay a price for it. Where in the world they have been able to solve a problem in urban context when they don't actually get involved in a conflict of interests? You see that many economic activities would then try to stop you when you want to conserve or develop one historic fabric. They would even blame you or offend you at the end of the day, and you don't succeed. So we need to know the interests of all the stakeholders, our beneficiaries, and see how we can align these interests towards, urban development and conservation of historic fabrics. And then we use the public opinion as a leverage. Our managers and directors ignore the, general public. They believe if you share it with general public, it's a big mistake. That is, prosecuted easily. But general public and public opinion is a leverage in exercising democracy, and that can assist urban management or municipalities. We used to say that, communities would cause a problem, we should solve them as government. But it's not the case. We need to protect cultural heritage. You talked about Australia, and then Canada and some other countries, many other countries, that's the case. I want to build on that example that last speaker said, even in Africa. Cultural heritage for us is different. It is the story of our survival. I use the theory of the Shin vacuum. There have been 6 main civilizations in the world. Persian and Chinese civilizations have survived. The identities have survived. But this has been only because of this our culture, partly a literature and our culture, and we have been able to protect them this way. You know, during Seljuk dynasty and restoration, experts say that they say that the quality of our buildings is low because we didn't have such professional architectures during Seljuk dynasty. But we now want to restore or conserve, you know, our historic buildings based on the historic patterns. Remember, our survival is indebted to these people and this culture. I used to speak with one director and said that your rhetoric is not influential enough and you do not raise awareness among senior executive people. And that's why our historic fabric is now in ramshackles. But we've had some civilizations who have, let's say, conquered our country, defeated our army. But what has remained there and survived are the cultural elements in our literature, our cultural historic buildings. So our cultural heritage should be considered at the level of our, you know, security issues and defense issues. That is a kind of defensive layer against cultural invasion. During Islam, before Islam invention, during Anushirwan I, we have this Baluch garden in Baluchestan province. And some people from Talash in northern Iran, they were forced to immigrate to that part of our country in southeast to stop invasion of other cultures. And they caused or stopped the kind of, you know, cultural wall. And for many centuries, because of this immigration, people have been kept as an Iranian identity. And, you know, Baluchi language and culture has been able to develop in those areas and protect them. So definitely, I should not limit myself to the administrative bodies. It is the survival of our culture. That's our survival of our identity. So it is different from Canadian or Australian models. Iran is in no way comparable with them. Heritage in our country is a matter of survival of our civilization. And we should also act accordingly. So as an expert in this area, I regret that to say that even people in the ministry are not aware of this, and they are just entangled in some regulations, laws, and legislations. Well, they are important too, but when they in abstinence, they are in abstinence, and then they're not aware of science. Well, that's useless. They become just like an, you know, the outer coating. We have for example, an expert in Najafabad city or Shahrazad towns, and these are the case studies, you know, and those are living examples. When there is a kind of, you know, mud building, which is not technically, in terms of architecture or historically, is not valuable, it is just made of mud. They don't let a kind of expressway to be built there because they say that's an, you know, the old building. But cultural heritage organization department has not been able to protect more valuable buildings. Yeah, Ali Ghapu and Chelsea should not be developed. But let's say the shoemakers building in Shahrawan can be developed where people are living at the residence. So let Iranians live there. I prefer for myself and you to go and live there and to benefit from the values and those values and that cultural atmosphere. It has been abandoned because you don't let say a window to be, or a modern window to be installed there or fitted there. So they abandon it. And you see just, some addicts, drug dependents, or Afghan refugees go there. And they will definitely inflict a lot of damage on that building. I remember that, Chelsea building in Bahawat, Isfahan, it was set on fire. That was a valuable, monument. So here we need to make some serious decisions, because that's the story of survival, I told you. If we are open and determined, we could definitely prevent many big damages, demolishes. So I should not suffice myself with some big documents. I've seen examples in other countries. In Paris, they arrive at a decision and explain the decision that, for example, what they have built, a refinery near Notre Dame, just George Amido is a nightmare for all of experts in Isfahan, for example. Okay, thank you, Doctor. We are just in the interest of time. We need to speak also about that tomb, Rasoul tomb. Mr. Farhangi, I'm going to ask you to address this question, Mr. Farhangi, and then we will present our case study. That's Rasoul tomb. Now, my question. Why there is this conservatism among professionals? Of course, if you agree that there is such a conservatism among professionals and experts. If so, why is it like that? Well, this discussion is very detailed, but if I want to address your question, I should tell you that Iran as a country has faced two or three issues. One is archaeology. I mean, archaeological excavations raise the ranking of a country or value of a country in the world. During Qajar dynasty, there were some agreements, two important agreements or contracts. They did they did their best to excavate this country due to the agreement with the French. And then later on, this turned into a kind of, idea to cultural heritage conservation among professionals. You know that in archaeology, they care about materials, cultural materials, and cultural material provides you with all information. That cultural substance and material should be protected fully in archaeology. So this issue or idea penetrated into our society first. The second one, penetrated after 1960s. We had, the cultural or historic monument center, cultural heritage organization, they protected historic spaces. So they regulated these cultural assets and they tried to protect them. The third movement that penetrated our cultural heritage area was what we call professional conservation implementation. What the last speaker mentioned in our city is this third movement. They want to protect or conserve the fabric as it is, and then as they are seen. There is, of course, a fourth movement, and it is the matter of restoration. I mean, any heritage relic left from the past generations to be part of our now today life, and its integration into our daily life. Of course, the cultural heritage as a concept that was based on research in archaeology and conservations in the 1960s, and then conservation in the 1970s and 2 or 3 decades after the revolution, turned into this regeneration or revival movement. Of course, the past movements did not come along with the new movements, but there was a new incident, development. They had some projects like Pakistan projects or that revival fund. They address many issues across Iran through people. In Yazd, for example, or in Kashan, they were not following, the general standard charters and guidelines, but they did it. Why? Because those who initiated this idea did not consider those, monuments as part of the honor. In a cultural heritage organization or educational system department, did not care about this that much. The private sector acted differently. In Kashan, we are restoring some buildings that are being, in my opinion, restored wrongly as an expert. But if I put on the hat of a person who cares about the future of Iran, I would definitely support it. So they are helping in restoration or revival. So Mr. Gohari's idea is being implemented in our country in one way or another. So I'd like to say that the more people participate in this area, the better it is. Of course, in short term, they would see some damages and counterproductive acts. But if we guide it well, in the future, that would be more productive. But if you're after just, prohibition for any interventions, and then, to, deprive the landlords from the benefiting from their buildings, and then they demolish the buildings based on some influence or relations. I think this public participation can be very helpful in our society, as there's a gap between our society and other countries' societies. Thank you, Mr. Farhangi. Well, I believe that we can now present Chabahar case study, or the tomb case study. Our time is short, so it would be great if you can present it in 10 minutes. And then last 10 minutes, Mr. Farhangi will talk, and that we would conclude our session afterwards. Okay, thank you. Okay, shall I share my screen, or how would I proceed? Okay. So the speaker is going to share his screen in a moment. This is the development project of Sayyid Rasoul Gholam tomb in Chabahar in southeastern Iran. That's a building from Timurid dynasty. It has a very interesting background story. You know, Sayyid Gholam Rasoul was a Sufi from the Indian subcontinent who was in Baluchestan. And you know, the interaction of this area, Chabahar, was usually with Indian subcontinent rather than the central government. He came to Iran to marry a local girl here. And the eve of his wedding, he passed away. And then he was a Sufi leader. So he said, he also had a testament. He said that don't grieve my death, but to celebrate it. So every year after his death, many people come together there at a certain date and they celebrate there, they hold parties. There is a big clan of dissidents of people from the east bank of Saint River. They have some faith between Sufi Islam and Indian, actual Indian schools of thought. They live there and they celebrate that date there. I had an advisor, Dr. Tabatabai, and Cultural Heritage Organization, and then we thought to turn this tomb into a museum of wedding. I mean, to turn its story, you know, audible to many people, to different people. And we thought of such a museum. That was our initiative. But we faced a kind of sudden risk. You know, the tomb, in our country, tombs and shrines can be inscribed. But we have an organization called endowment and charity organization, and they keep protecting these assets as part of their own assets. And they have different real estates and lands in different provinces. It is a rich organization, but in Baluchistan, especially in Baluchistan, as people's faith does not care about making shrines, you know. People over there do, you know, they have a different faith or a school of thought. They, of course, respect graves and tombs, but there's no Imam shrine or holy shrine like among Shiites in Baluchistan. There was one exception, and that was Sayyid Gholam Rasoul. And Sufis, local Sufis are protecting this building, you know. And there, that was their only asset. I mean, the endowment organization's asset was this. And a big number of tourists used to visit this tomb. They thought of constructing a hotel near this tomb. And we immediately rolled up our sleeves, and then, you know, after the damages or stories we had in 2005, and you know, that organization was dismantled one way or another there, we didn't have any technical support office. There was no office to develop blueprints and plans for a plot. So in the province, I thought to re-establish a technical support office. It was part of my authority in the Cultural Heritage Department, and I managed to do it. And there were some people involved in conservation, and I was also part of this team, and we did some planning for some lands. It was like an ensemble. There were some, gravestones, and we turned it into a kind of certain complex or ensemble around this tomb. Also, there was a parking lot, and we just let that parking lot be maybe a land for building a hotel. This is near the beach of Chabahar. Many tourists could visit it. And also, its architecture has been inspired by Indian architecture. But this is a kind of Iranian version of Indian architecture, I can tell you. Especially in the dome, you see that it has been really inspired by Indian architecture. That's also endorsed by many experts. They had some, let's say, inappropriate annexations, like this room. This room was connected to it. It had some, like a prayer room. This is a room added to the tomb so that people can go into it to say prayers. And it had been restored, especially, in flooring, not in the form, or let's say rectification of the design lines. The interior, you see, and also the main entrance. And these are the timbers from the original architecture or building. And we had also some decorations. We did our best to protect the building and release some parts for development projects for the endowment organization if they want to construct a building. And we wanted to, save and protect and conserve this main ensemble or complex. You see it in this picture. This is the tomb. Detached from its annexations, we use some spider glass casing around it on one side, so that we can protect the facade against monsoon rainfalls. And it would be also glass that can be seen easily. It was a simple, I can tell you, glacier, and then used in many parts of the world as a kind of glass wall to protect historic buildings. And then we had the waiting room here. We had some area to protect the gravestones. And we stopped any future developments or prevent any future developments. This is the tomb. This is the supporting space. This is the waiting room, and also the ceremony room. There was also a kind of pole here that they tied some fabrics to it, some textile to it, and then we had for prayers and some graves. We protected these gravestones over there. And this is the parking space, parking lot. We made it available to the endowment organization for any future developments or development projects. We did this plan thanks to our technical support office, and we took it to the provincial capital. There were some people, academicians, and the headquarters, and we discussed it in detail, and that was approved in the provincial capital or the headquarters. And when we wanted to start, our work, it was reported to Tehran, and the Restoration and Conservation Department manager there in Tehran started to impede this process. I took it to the central government and the organization, the headquarters, Ministry of Cultural Organization in Tehran. It was discussed with the experts. There was also a deputy minister or vice president, and I talked about it. I told them what risks are now pending, and this is an emergency plan for conservation. And we're after a plan to make it into, or turn it into a museum, like a wedding museum, to be able to protect it more. So it was not welcome in that meeting. People in that organization were really protesting loud, speaking up against this plan. Many people disagreed. We thought of, kind of special kind of facade like this. And this is the front elevation. We used a kind of glass casing. Can you see the glass casing in the slide? Yeah. This is a glass casing to protect decorations on the facade. And we used some minimum metal scaffoldings or structure to protect the facade against rain. And you see the floor is made of wood, this wooden floor. And people can walk on it, barefoot, because worshippers come there with bare feet, they don't put on shoes. I want to tell you what problems we faced. We presented this. This is a kind of modern facade. They said it comes from, inspired by Western architecture, and the architecture is not deeply rooted. They started making such arguments. I'm an architect. I know architecture very well, and I know Iranian traditional architecture very well. And you see many monuments in Iran, important monuments. They were really the most modern, the best in the historic era they were in. You can start with Persepolis, you can start to Safavid monuments, and even Qajar dynasty monuments. I mean, they wanted to make it the best in their era or epoch of history. So those who care about, identity, they cannot really argue against just a piece of glass. I mean, but that glass casing was making them upset. They called it Western culture element, Western architecture element. But I disagreed, We shouldn't just stop some techniques or technologies to be used. We shouldn't politicize the issues. That's really regrettable. So I discussed that. And the then director intervened and supported our project, our plan. And with his intervention, it was approved in that Supreme Council of Cultural Heritage, but has not been implemented up to today. Even for conservation, I mean, this monument is still at the risk of collapse. So I wanted to show you this example as a challenge you're facing. This project may upset some, let's say, conservation experts, or it is against some macro policies of the Cultural Heritage Organization. And this, they wanted to stop it, and that, you know, it was an impediment, and it causes damage to this building, this monument. In 2016, I just tendered my resignation, and I'm a kind of, we call it the breathed manager of the Cultural Heritage Organization. Yeah, I, of course, respect experts and professionals in that organization. I know they care about the cultural heritage. Dr. Moshtagh, your connection is not so. It is inevitable. We remember, we just don't need to conserve a monument just for a tourist or to be discussed in some, you know, academic circle. Sorry, that's not our what we care about. It is not a kind of advantage. We should protect them against collapse or demolition. You know, when we talk about environmental damages, the same we see in cultural heritage. We can't really be silent here. We need to speak loud. One of the senior managers in the ministry does not have that technical knowledge about such monuments. I've been for years, you know, I've studied cultural heritage. I've worked in this area for many years. We should definitely have a kind of policy and approach which has been well tested and well planned, and people like me should be selected as a minister to implement those projects. People in that ministry just stop any kind of conservation in this, from this dimension. Let me make one comment. They assume management position without any background in this area, like the minister, and then they leave after some years. You know, this minister, they wanted to appoint him as a minister of culture, but he was appointed minister of cultural heritage. So we have only one person, you know, who is a professional in, you know, archaeological cultural heritage. Well, you know, in different organizations and departments at the local level will definitely want you to ask for their approval, even in the smallest towns across the world. But, you know, for a political decision, they have been made or given a kind of political position, no? So just political atmosphere. A governor tell me, or just comes to me and says, why did you appoint this person X as the manager of an office, you know? And I have to fight with him or her. I say that, okay, that was the best and the most qualified person for this position, and that's why I appoint him as a manager of an office. So you have to get involved in such political fightings with governors, governor generals, and different directors. Remember, one person cannot protect all these monuments. Many people should get involved, not to talk generally, and speak their mind to the point and openly and frankly. Otherwise, you should definitely be exposed to protesters from the next generations. Thank you for the opportunity I was given to speak in this seminar. Thank you, Doctor, for your great presentation. Mr. Farhangi, we are out of time. I'm going to ask you to be very brief and to speak about such a case study. And I ask you to have your ideas on this project for a few minutes. Thank you, Dr. Gohari, for his presentation and this case study. There are almost no department in the ministry to do such designing. I remember Dr. Shirazi, the late Dr. Shirazi, did some designing 2 or 3 hours in the morning then. And some provincial experts and also directors did some designing, but of course, based on old styles. But some outstanding designs for historic monuments have not been, presented a lot. This one, as Doctor said, this is a kind of, I can tell you, well, at a high level that can be criticized too. But the problem is implementation. He's complaining, and he's definitely, he can complain about it. If one organization or department or ministry is against one project, they should offer an alternative. As a matter of fact, we don't have an integrated system for such projects. We consider our preferences, social circumstances, and then conservation, and so on and so forth. It depends on the weight of people in a meeting. Yeah, as you said, the deputy minister, intervened, and that was approved, and some were against him and wanted to stop it. That is the situation in our country. Generally speaking, I don't see any problems in this project. And I'm not going to provide a kind of detailed criticism on this project to support future similar projects in the interest of time. So that's all from me as a kind of comment on this project. Thank you. Let me make a comment. Thank you, Mr. Farhangi. You are right, Mr. Farhangi. We are in a case of emergency. We just want to save such monuments, such buildings and areas. Maybe our project is not ideal, but that can prevent collapse. As there is no technical support office anymore for designing, there can be a kind of, let's say, general contest or competition, or that can be made available to general public opinion for support, and then offer alternatives if possible. Cultural heritage, as that's, we are like a kind of who has been trusted or entrusted these monuments. We don't own them, but some directors and managers and officials and politicians, they believe they are the owners of these monuments, a part of their property. Yeah, thank you. Okay, this is Q&A, now part of our session or seminar. Are there any questions? Let's see if any participants have any questions, as we are beyond the time of our agenda. Okay, if anybody's got questions, you can pose your questions and continue this session.
dear participants, if anyone has a question, we can ask you to unmute yourself. A participant asks Dr. Moshtagh-Gohari if they have used the method of AHP in evaluating the project or the situation. I'm not informed about the method, but Dr. Gohari, could you please answer?
Yeah. Yes, I know this method very well. That's a kind of multifactorial decision making, which is very much valid in urban complex urban management decision making process. And it can set a few objectives and then arrive at a final decision based on these different, interests and objectives. It can consider interests of the endowment organization, for example, the municipality interests, and also cultural heritage department interests, and then arrive at a decision. Yeah, but I should be open. Governmental decision makers, and political decisions are based on individuals' preferences, not on such scientific approaches. Yes, universities and cultural heritage organizations are very much influenced by politicians. That's why their managers and directors are politicians and influenced by politicians. Many experts have to, follow political documents, which has caused a lot of damage, especially in cultural heritage area. So we see many years of experience that tourism is shut down in our country. We don't see a lot of, tourists from other countries, but cultural heritage is a falls victim to tourism. And they just want to introduce only tourism to cultural heritage to add value to it, to just create jobs, 30, 40 jobs. And they marginalize cultural heritage this way. So I want to say that even in tourism, we have only cultural tourism. In handicraft area, only the ones or elements that are culturally and historically important, can bring some market. So tourism is limited to heritage tourism, cultural tourism, despite all the limitations. So we should, a director or manager who is going to steer this ministry organization should have knowledge of cultural heritage. These politicians come from an unknown background, become a minister, and then go to another unknown position later on after this position. And in the future, don't see them anymore. So, as such, politicians are at the steering helm of this organization. We are not going to proceed very well. In the near future, we are going to push the governments to appoint managers who are well-versed and knowledgeable in this area, in the area of cultural heritage. Sometimes you see the deputy minister, even the deputy minister has no knowledge of cultural heritage. and you see what happens. I'm really sad about an expert who is a staff member of the ministry and who have to listen to the politicians who have nothing about this area and have to endorse or approve them. Well, about the new minister, I should tell you that there should be a just sit in or just try to protest. Thank you, Doctor. Time is up, and I really appreciate Mr. Farhangi, Dr. Moshtagh-Gohari, and Dr. Yadukahiri, and Ms. Farahani, and all the dear participants who joined our event. I hope it has been fruitful and we've been able to share some great ideas here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, and bye.
And I would like to thank you, dear speakers, Adel Farhangi and Kambiz Moshtagh-Gohari. It was a really insightful discussion for me. And thank you, Hadi Naderi. Thank you for accepting our invitation and discussing and sharing with us your insights about the local issues or your insider perspective in Chabahar and also in heritage-related organizations. Thank you very much. And dear participants, thank you for staying with us, although we were a little bit beyond our time. If you don't have any questions, then we can close the discussion, I think. If you have anything to add, Kambiz Farhangi and Dr. Moshtagh-Gohari.
Thank you very much indeed. I hope you keep up this great work. Thank you and have a good day. Yeah, thank you from me too. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.